Right around this time every year, something familiar starts to happen. The excitement fades. The momentum slows. The clarity you felt a few days ago starts to blur. You didn't quit. You didn't fail. You didn't give up. You just slipped back. And that's what makes it confusing. Because on the surface, nothing went wrong. But underneath, an old pattern quietly took control. Most people assume this happens because motivation runs out. But motivation was never the issue. The real reason people get pulled back is something far subtler and far more powerful. An identity trap. An internal pattern that activates right when change starts becoming real. It sounds like, "This is just who I am. I always end up back here. I've tried this before. I don't want to get my hopes up." Those thoughts don't feel dramatic. They feel true. And that's why they're dangerous. Because the moment you believe them, your system relaxes back into the familiar. You stop pushing, not because you're tired, but because the old identity has reasserted control. And until you see that trap clearly, it will quietly reset your progress every time growth gets uncomfortable. What comes next is understanding how this trap forms and why it feels so convincing, even when it's holding you back. The identity trap doesn't announce itself. It doesn't feel like fear. It doesn't feel like resistance. It feels like self-knowledge. It feels like you're being realistic. It feels like you're managing expectations. It feels like you're protecting yourself from disappointment. But what's actually happening is much deeper. Your identity is built from what your nervous system learned about what is safe to expect. And once an identity is formed, your system works quietly to preserve it. Not because it's true, but because it's familiar. So when you start changing patterns, your nervous system checks for danger. And if the new behavior doesn't match the old identity, an alarm sounds. Not loud, not obvious, subtle. Doubt creeps in. Urgency fades. The old story reappears, and the trap closes. This is why people often feel relief when they return to old patterns. Relief doesn't mean alignment. It means familiarity. Your system relaxes because it recognizes the territory. This is the part most people never learn. The identity trap feels safe, not because it's good for you, but because it's known. That's why willpower fails here. That's why pushing harder backfires. That's why people feel like they're fighting themselves. They are, but not against a flaw, against a pattern designed to keep things predictable. Once you see this, the struggle makes sense, and the solution changes. Because you don't escape an identity trap by proving it wrong. You escape it by teaching your nervous system that something new can also be safe. What comes next is the moment that shift begins, the realization that lets you step out of the trap without triggering collapse. There is a moment when you stop asking, "Why do I keep ending up here?" and start asking a far more powerful question. What identity does this pattern protect? Because every repeated pattern is loyal to something. It's loyal to a version of you that once needed it. Maybe it protected you from rejection. Maybe it helped you avoid disappointment. Maybe it kept you from taking risks that once felt too costly. Whatever the reason, the pattern stayed. And over time, it stopped feeling like a strategy and started feeling like you. This is the deep shift. You are not stuck because you lack discipline. You are stuck because your identity is outdated. The version of you running the system was built for a different chapter, different stakes, different environment, different emotional needs. But your nervous system hasn't updated the file yet. So when you try to change, it pulls you back, not to sabotage you, but to preserve coherence, because coherence feels safer than growth. The trap loosens the moment you see this clearly. You stop personalizing the pull backward. You stop shaming yourself for hesitation. You stop forcing momentum. And instead, you bring awareness. Awareness creates distance. Distance creates choice. You notice the urge to retreat, the urge to delay, the urge to settle back into what's known. And instead of obeying it, you pause. Not to fight it, but to recognize it. That's the old identity speaking. That single moment of recognition is powerful, because the moment you can observe an identity, you are no longer fully inside it. You've stepped out of the trap. And once you're out, you don't need to destroy the old identity. You just need to stop letting it decide what happens next. What comes next is how to move forward in a way that doesn't trigger the trap again. How to create change that the nervous system can accept and sustain. Escaping the identity trap doesn't require a breakthrough. It requires consistency without drama. Because the trap tightens when change feels threatening, not when it feels gradual. So the shift here is subtle but powerful. You move forward without trying to prove you've changed. The old identity survives on proof. Proof that you're capable, proof that you won't fail, proof that this time is different. And proving keeps you trapped, because proof invites pressure. Pressure activates fear. Fear reactivates the trap. So instead, you choose actions that are quiet and repeatable. Not big declarations, not public commitments, not all or nothing moves. Just small, grounded behaviors that contradict the old pattern without challenging it directly. If the old identity pulls you toward delay, you take one step, then stop. If it pulls you toward overthinking, you choose clarity, then rest. If it pulls you toward self-criticism, you respond with neutrality, not encouragement, not punishment. Each of these moments sends a signal to your nervous system. We're not forcing anything. We're not abandoning safety. We're just moving differently. And that matters, because the nervous system doesn't resist change. It resists threat. When change feels non-threatening, the trap loosens naturally. You stop feeling pulled backward. You stop needing to fight yourself. You stop oscillating between effort and collapse. Movement becomes calm, and calm movement is how identity updates, not through intensity, through repetition that feels safe enough to become normal. What comes next is the final realization, the understanding of what happens once the identity trap no longer controls how you relate to your past or your future. There is a moment when the identity trap loses its power, not because you fought it, not because you overpowered it, but because you no longer mistake it for who you are. You realize that pull backward was never a flaw. It was familiarity. And familiarity only controls you until you see it clearly. Once you do, something settles. You stop trying to outrun your past. You stop negotiating with old patterns. You stop forcing progress. You begin to move forward without urgency. And that's the shift. Because urgency is what kept you trapped. Urgency kept you proving. Urgency kept you bracing. Urgency kept you reacting. Calm movement changes the rules. When you move calmly, the nervous system doesn't resist. The old identity doesn't activate. The trap doesn't close. You simply become someone who no longer lives from outdated patterns, not by rejecting them, but by outgrowing them. And from that place, change doesn't collapse under pressure. It stabilizes. You stop repeating the same cycles with new intentions layered on top. You start living from an identity that no longer needs to reset itself. And that's when growth becomes sustainable. Not because you finally got it right, but because you stopped asking your system to live in a way it didn't feel safe inside. The identity trap dissolves the moment safety and movement stop being opposites. And when that happens, old patterns lose relevance. They no longer define you. They no longer direct you. They no longer decide what happens next. You do.